to this lecture series for ethics. In this video we will begin our discussion and examination of the moral theory of the British philosopher John Stuart Mill. It was the theory he expressed in his famous book entitled Utilitarianism, which was originally published in 1861. Now before we jump into the text and see exactly what Mill has to say about ethics and how it might be different from some of the theories and ideas we've discussed thus far, I want to make a few more general comments about how what we'll be doing in this lesson marks a transition from the first part of the course. So you'll recall that in the very first week of the class I outlined this basic distinction between questions about what it means to live well and questions about what it means to act well. We said the major thinker we were going to discuss in the first half of the course was Aristotle, and Aristotle was very intimately concerned with how we live a good human life. He thought our lives were oriented toward happiness or eudaimonia, which he defined or understood as a sort of human flourishing, and we can only flourish insofar as we are virtuous, insofar as we have the virtues such as courage and temperance and justice and honesty. And so for Aristotle, his main moral or ethical concern is, how do we become the right sort of person? How do we become a person which embodies human perfection? And of course we saw this same thing in Aquinas, although put in a sort of theological or religious context. Now the reason I bring this up is because I think those sorts of questions about how to live well, how to structure your entire life, what your whole life should be oriented toward, are critical questions. But to some extent, the theory of Aristotle and focusing too much just on that question can leave something out. And to make this point, I want to consider again briefly the virtue of courage in Aristotle's analysis of it. So you remember that Aristotle says a virtue is a mean between two extremes, and in the case of courage, the deficiency is cowardice, right? You don't have enough of this disposition to face danger. The excess is rashness, you face danger too much. And courage just is in the middle of those. It's the perfect point at which you're hitting the mean and you have things just right. So let's imagine, and this sounds good. You say, well, yeah, certainly I don't want to be the person who is cowardly. I don't want to also be someone who's rash and faces danger unnecessarily. But there's a more fundamental question here. How do I know whether I've faced danger unnecessarily or not? Let's suppose, for instance, that you see someone in danger. You can think back to one of the cases we talked about in a much earlier video where there was someone who put their own life on the line to save someone who was going to be killed by a runaway subway train. Right? They literally put their own life on the line, dragged this person out of harm's way. And you might say immediately, well, this seems like a very courageous action. This person must embody courage. But notice Aristotle says there can be an excess of facing danger, and that's rashness. And we might wonder, well, when is it unreasonable to face danger? This is a person with a family and people who depended on him and friends and loved ones. You might say, well, yes, it's good he saved that person, but was it actually reckless to put his own life on the line in that way, given all the people that depend on him and love him? And I could see having a real discussion about that point that would say, look, you might say, well, maybe you shouldn't have put your life on the line in that way, even though it worked out. Or maybe you should have. Maybe courage requires us to think about other people in a more acute way than just those that we know, just our acquaintances or our family and friends and people who love us. And my point here isn't to sort of give an answer to that question. It's just to ask, to what extent does Aristotle give us the tools or the means to answer that question? To what extent does Aristotle actually give us any guidance in answering that question? And you could do it with any of the virtues. The virtue of temperance. How do I know if I'm pursuing pleasure too much or too little? With honesty. How do I know if I'm being, overly honest or if I'm have a deficiency in that respect? Right? With any of the virtues, we can always ask the question, how do we know if we're hitting the mean? And I think the sort of advice that Aristotle gives us is instructive here. Here's a quote that we looked at previously. Actions then are called just and temperate when they are such as the just and the temperate person would do. But the just and temperate person is not one who does them merely, but the one who does them just as just and temperate people do. So what is Aristotle's fundamental answer when you ask him, how do I know if I have hit the mean of courage? How do I know if I'm facing danger in the right way, in the right circumstance, to the right degree, with the right people, etc., etc.? Aristotle will say, well, you are doing it correctly if you're displaying courage as the courageous person would do. But of course, this isn't very helpful advice, because now I have to identify, well, who are the courageous people? Just the people that my culture or society tells me are courageous? How do I know they're doing it correctly? If we don't have some more general guidelines as to what is the right way to face danger and in what circumstances, and how we know whether some action of facing danger is right or wrong, then it might seem like we're just sort of we're just stabbing in the dark here. We know that we're supposed to hit a mean between excess and deficiency, but it's not clear that Aristotle actually gives us the tools to figure out how, other than that telling us to do it as the courageous person does. But if we don't know what courage implies for our action, then how do we identify who the courageous people are in the first place? So we seem to have a bit of a problem here. And the reason I bring this up is because this is the difference between theories that maybe focus more on how to live well and theories that focus more on how to act well. As I said previously, the question of how to act well is, okay, so we label all these actions in our lives good or bad or right or wrong. How do we know whether an action, a single discrete action, is right or wrong? How do we know whether it's good or bad? As Mill is going to put it, what is the criterion that we're using to judge whether an action is morally good or morally bad? And when we're asking that question, it's not as though it's divorced from questions of how to live well. A good life would be made up of course, of morally good actions. But we're sort of abstracting away from that and just saying, fundamentally, what is it about actions that makes them good and bad, or right or wrong? And this seems to be an element that to some extent is missing from Aristotle's theory. Now, if it is true that Aristotle's account of ethics doesn't give us quite enough guidance as to what makes a specific action morally good or bad, then we can at least see that for Mill, in his work on utilitarianism, which is his moral theory that we'll be looking at, he is very acutely concerned with this question. So in this video, we're mostly going to be looking at the first chapter of Mill's Utilitarianism and a few passages from it. And one of the things you see in the very first paragraph of this work is that he is lamenting what he calls the little progress which has been made in the decision of the controversy respecting the criterion of right and wrong. So what is he saying here? He says, look, people have been talking about ethics and morality for over 2,000 years, and he says, unfortunately, we've made very little headway in determining what is the criterion of a good action, what is the criterion of a bad action. We might all agree with Aristotle that we should be courageous, we should be honest, we should be just, we should be temperate. But we might all disagree about what exactly that means, and how we ought to act in specific circumstances. So Mill is lamenting this fact that we don't seem to have a consensus about what it means for an action to be right or wrong. And in order to remedy this, what we need is some sort of more general theory that tells us what it is about good actions that makes them good, and what is it about bad actions that makes them bad. So when Mill talks about a criterion of right and wrong, the way I'm going to think about that is what I'm going to call a theory of right action. Okay, so what's a theory of right action? A theory of right action provides a general account of 1, what makes some action good, ethically right, virtuous, etc., and 2, of what makes some action bad, ethically wrong, or vicious. So when you say that honesty is good or morally right, when you say that injustice is bad or morally wrong, what a theory of right action would do would tell you what it is about honesty that makes it good, what it is about injustice that makes it wrong. And it would do that not just by focusing on those things in particular, it would do that by telling you this is what it means for an action to be good. This is what it means for an action to be bad. Now, I think the best way to understand this point is to look at a specific example. So here is one theory of right action. It's not one we're going to have much time to discuss in very much detail in this class, but it is helpful in that it sort of gets you to see what a theory of right action is. So this theory is called divine command theory. And here's what the theory says. Divine command theory holds that some action A is good or bad just because God chose to make A good or bad. God's commands to humans about what is morally good or bad are purely the product of God's will. So the idea behind divine command theory is just that what makes murder wrong, what makes honesty good, what makes courage good, what makes intemperance bad, is that God chose to make those things good or bad. What makes something good is that God says it's good. What makes something bad is that God said it was bad. And, you can debate, and there is extensive philosophical debate about whether that's a good theory or not. It's certainly not, just to be clear, it's not the theory Mill held. But I'm just trying to explain what the basic structure of a theory of right action is. So if you accept divine command theory, whenever you ask the question, why is lying wrong, why is theft wrong, why is murder wrong, generosity good, courage admirable, whenever you ask any question like that, the answer will always bottom out in the will of God or the commands of God. That's what divine command theory says. And so, whether it's true or not, divine command theory, it qualifies as a theory of right action. And it does so because it gives a general explanation of goodness or badness from a moral point of view. Okay, now like I said, this is not Mill's theory. So what is, in fact, the theory of right action that Mill held? Well, I told you it's utilitarianism. That, in fact, is the title of his book in which he expounds this theory. And we're going to take some time over the next couple of videos, and really for a number of weeks, looking at all the various components of utilitarianism and seeing how it can be applied to various practical issues. But for the moment, we can give a general first definition as to what utilitarianism is. So utilitarianism holds that the ethically correct action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. All actions which don't produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number are wrong to that extent. So what does this mean? Well, divine command theory said, well, what makes an action good? Because God says it's good. What makes it bad? Because God says it's bad. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, says, no, what makes an action good is that it produces happiness. It produces happiness for the greatest number possible. And likewise, a bad action is just an action which doesn't produce happiness for the greatest number. It produces sadness, it produces misery, it produces suffering. That's the basic idea behind utilitarianism. It's a relatively simple theory on its face, although, as we're going to see, it has a number of complications and different components we'll be getting into. But as a sort of interesting point, Mill is not the first utilitarian. In fact, he sort of comes from this family line of utilitarians. And even this formulation of the greatest happiness for the greatest number doesn't first come from Mill. There was a British philosopher named Francis Hutcheson who, in his inquiry into the original of our ideas of beauty and virtue, used this phrase. He said, that action is best which procures the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers, and that worse which in like manner occasions misery. So, divine command theory and utilitarianism are both theories of right action, and they're similar to that extent. They're also similar in that they provide a sort of neat and clean explanation of what makes an action right or wrong. So you can ask all the same questions of utilitarianism. You ask a utilitarian like Mill, why is lying wrong? Why is theft wrong? Why is murder wrong? Why is generosity good? Why is courage admirable? And the answer will always be because those things contribute or take away from the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Why is lying wrong? It produces misery. It produces sadness and suffering. Why is generosity good? It produces happiness. It produces pleasure. And it does so for the greatest number of individuals possible. So we can see here the basic idea behind a theory of right action is just that it provides this general explanation of moral rightness and moral wrongness. So now that we have seen what a theory of right action is and seen a preview of the utilitarian theory Mill is going to offer, we should say a little more about what motivates Mill to seek a theory of right action, or as he says, the criterion of right or wrong. Now, as I already suggested, in this first paragraph, he is lamenting the fact that we've made little progress on the criterion of right or wrong. We haven't seemed to reach consensus. And he continues to explain this point and seems very distressed by the fact that there seems to be so much moral disagreement. So he says these moral questions have occupied the most gifted intellects, divided them into sects and schools, carrying on a vigorous warfare against one another. And after more than 2,000 years, neither thinkers nor mankind at large seem near to being unanimous on the subject. Now, what he's talking about directly here is this question of what is the highest good? What is the very foundation of morality? And that's sort of a theoretical question, and he's right that many philosophers have argued amongst themselves on this issue. But we might also look at this in the more practical sphere. So think about the fact that for any very controversial ethical question, for any ethical question that people really talk about, abortion, euthanasia, the death penalty, any of these sorts of moral and political issues, think about how much disagreement there is on those issues. Also think about the extent to which this disagreement can be quite heated, can be quite, it can feature a lot of animosity. If you think about having a debate on any of those subjects, just the thought of it can be quite uncomfortable because you know how strongly people with different opinions will react on those issues. It seems very reminiscent of the sort of vigorous warfare against one another that Mill is describing here. And we might reflect on this a little bit and ask ourselves, why is it that whenever a contentious moral issue like that comes up, it does sort of encourage such animosity and encourages a sort of warfare? Why is that the case? And to be specific, let's think about for a little bit, just at a meta level, one issue, a practical moral issue we'll be talking about later in this course, which is euthanasia. So in a few weeks, we will look at how the utilitarian moral theory is applied to euthanasia and also consider some critiques of it. Now, the question I want to ask here is not about euthanasia itself, but first, why do people disagree so strongly about it? It's not unique in that sense. Other moral issues people disagree about strongly as well, but it is certainly one issue that causes people to disagree so strongly. And why is that? Well, we might think about what are some reasons given for either side, right? Someone, might say, well, all life is valuable in and of itself, and so to end life through euthanasia is wrong. Someone else might say, no, what makes life valuable is the extent to which that life is filled with pleasure or pain, and so if someone is experiencing pain toward the end of their life, then euthanasia would not be wrong. There might also be disagreements about whether some acts in themselves, acts which cause the death of another being, are inherently wrong, or if the goodness or badness of an action is just judged by its consequences. Right? Is it always wrong necessarily to end another life, or is it only wrong to end another life when doing so brings about a bad consequence? And so these are all questions that relate to euthanasia, and they're all questions we're actually going to get into in a detailed way. But the first point I want to make is that these are questions that people disagree about strongly, and that would suggest that to some extent, if there is so much disagreement and lack of consensus on those issues, then maybe the real issue here is that we have not been able to arrive at a theory of right action we can all agree with. To put it in Mill's terms, we have not yet arrived at a consensus on the criterion of right and wrong. And perhaps that is our fundamental problem, which explains why so many moral issues devolve into heated debate. Because instead of working from a common basis of understanding about what morality implies or entails, we're working off sort of our gut instincts. What we initially feel to be right, what we were taught is right by our social community, religious community, peer group, etc. And if we all come at these questions from different perspectives, and all have sort of different gut reactions, and we don't have any criterion of right or wrong that we all assent to or think is correct, then of course we're going to fall into very heated and disagreements with a lot of animosity and a lot of, as Mill says, vigorous warfare. So, to better understand this idea of why we need a criterion of right action, a criterion of right and wrong, I want to think about the following hypothetical case and use it to motivate the idea that we need a theory of right action. Okay, so here's the case. Imagine you're a district attorney in a town where a tragic murder of a young child has occurred. You have no leads on who committed the crime, but suspect the person has already left town and that you will not be able to catch the culprit. Emotions are running high and many people are extremely angry. Suppose you know that the citizens will soon riot unless someone is arrested for the crime, and that if the riots occur, many people will be harmed and killed. You know that you could prevent the riots by arresting and charging one innocent person with the crime. This person is not particularly well liked by the other people in the town, and many people already suspect he is guilty. So if you punish this person, no one will find out that you punished an innocent person. Should you punish this innocent person with the crime? Now here's the question you should think about, or I want you to think about for a minute. Obviously the question here is what should be done, but first think about what is the strongest argument in favor of either position. So on the one hand, the situation here is that we know that if we arrest and punish an innocent person, then we will prevent riots from occurring, which will cause a lot of damage and even loss of life. And so on the one hand, you say, well, look, maybe the right thing to do if I want to prevent harm, if I want to prevent suffering, if I want to save as many lives as possible, maybe the right thing to do is arrest and punish someone I know to be innocent. I mean, yes, it's unfortunate for this innocent person that they have to be sort of sacrificed for the good of the whole, for the good of the community. But on the other hand, what makes them so special? Why is their life so important that it outweighs the greater number of lives that would be lost if we don't punish this innocent person? And it's not like we want to do this all the time. It's just an extreme circumstance. It's just an exception. It's just something where we have to take an extreme action we would normally take to prevent a disaster from occurring. So on the one hand, you might say, well, maybe to save lives, to prevent suffering and harm, we should punish the innocent person. On the other hand, you might give the exact opposite answer. You might say, well, wait a minute, no, we can't do that. You might grant, okay, maybe we could save more lives, prevent more suffering by punishing this innocent person, but isn't it just a fundamental bedrock principle of justice that only the guilty should be punished? The innocent should never be punished. And in fact, don't we think it's a great miscarriage of justice, a horrible tragedy, when by accident we do punish an innocent person? Isn't that why we have all these legal safeguards in place to make it difficult, or at least more difficult, to punish innocent people? And you might say this is all based on this idea that people have fundamental individual rights. And you can't trample on someone's on their individual right to live peaceably as they see fit, especially if they're innocent, just because it would be to the benefit of the greater group. So the reason I bring this up is that there are two sort of answers to this question, and both really pull at some bedrock moral principles that we think are important. If you say yes, you should punish the innocent person, it's probably because you think that what's important here is preventing harm. If you say no, it's probably because you think it's important not to violate the individual rights and dignity of persons, and it's important to act with justice for individuals. Both of these are important moral and ethical values. No one would deny that. But notice now, if we're to come to a final decision about what should be done with this case, we can't just say that both of these are important values. We have to know which of them is the most important. Which of these is what truly characterizes what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And that means the whole way in which we approach moral cases like this has to be flipped around. Because I think oftentimes when you approach a moral case like euthanasia or this hypothetical instance, again, we approach it with sort of our gut instinct, our gut feeling, and we just work from there. But of course, first of all, different people can have different gut instincts, and you yourself might even be divided on what your gut or your immediate instinct is telling you. You might say, well, yeah, on the one hand, I think we should prevent harm. On the other hand, it seems unfair to punish an innocent person. So if we're to cut through all that, if we're going to transcend just all the immediate reactions that different people have from different circumstances in life, if we're going to transcend our own different reactions we have within ourselves, then we need some more general theory of rightness and wrongness. We need to know what's more important, preventing harm or protecting individual rights. And this is why Mill says in that second paragraph, a test of right and wrong must be the means one would think of ascertaining what is right or wrong. What he's saying here is that in order to know what is right or wrong in any specific instance, we already need to know what the test of right and wrong is, what the criterion of right and wrong is. And that is why a theory of right action is so important. If we have a theory of right action, then we have a consistent basis to evaluate whether some action is good or bad. Without a theory of right action, we're just sort of stabbing in the dark, we're just using our instinct, we're just relying on our gut, which can be extremely variable, extremely subjective, and it's not clear why we should think it should track what we think is morally right in the first place. So all that is to say, this is what Mill sets out to do in utilitarianism, to identify what the fundamental characteristic of right and wrong is. And in the videos to come, we will see in more detail what he thinks that test in fact is and how he uses it and applies it to specific moral and practical questions. Okay, so I will cut this video there. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.